Welcome to the Explainer. We're about to tackle a really heavy question today. Why was the 20th century, the one our grandparents lived through, the single most violent in all of human history? We're going to dive into the history and try to understand the roots and, the absolutely devastating impact of these mass atrocities in the modern era. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the sheer mind-boggling scale of the violence. Then, we'll track how it all evolved through the world wars. After that, we'll get into that famous vow, never again, that came out of all that horror. And finally, we'll have to face the tough part, how that promise, well, it's been broken, again and again. So, the 20th century, it has this really dark, unique distinction. It was by far the most violent period in all of recorded history. I mean, when you add up the death toll from its wars, its genocides, all the state-sponsored atrocities, it's a number that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're talking well over 100 million people. And a number like that, it just forces you to stop and ask, right? Why? What was it about that century specifically? You've got new technologies, new ideologies, these massive global conflicts. What was the recipe that led to such an unbelievable, unprecedented scale of devastation? All right, let's start digging for some answers. And our search begins with World War I. Now, this war wasn't just about the huge number of casualties. It was a war that completely and tragically changed the rules of the game. It reshaped the very idea of what violence could be. You see, World War I brought about this horrifying new reality. For the first time, on a scale this massive, the number of civilians who died was almost the same as the number of soldiers. This was the birth of what we call total war. Suddenly, industrial technology meant that the home front was the battlefield. That line between a soldier and a civilian, it got completely and deliberately erased by things like blockades and bombing from the air. And this new era of total war, it also forced the world to come up with a new word for a very old, very terrible crime. The word is genocide. It comes from the Greek word for race or tribe and the Latin for to kill. It was created to describe something specific, the deliberate, systematic destruction of an entire group of people. A horror that was, in fact, happening during the war itself. And this brings us to a really painful point, one that highlights this ongoing conflict over memory and over truth. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire accused its Christian Armenian minority of siding with Russia. And because of that, they orchestrated their forced deportation. This wasn't just a move. It led to the deaths of up to 1.5 million people. Now, to this day, most historians and, of course, the Armenian people themselves call this what it was, a clear act of genocide. But the modern Turkish government has a different position. They maintain that these deaths were a tragic result of wartime conditions and civil unrest, not a deliberate state-sponsored policy of extermination. So, you'd think after the war to end all wars, there'd be peace, right? Well, not exactly. The period between the wars and then going into World War II didn't bring peace at all. Instead, the ways of killing people on a mass scale just got more diversified, and they were carried out with a terrifying, almost industrial kind of efficiency. Take the Soviet Union, for instance. Here, the violence took the form of a man-made famine. What happened was, when Ukrainian peasants resisted Stalin's new policy of agricultural collectivization, the state's response was brutal. They just seized all their crops to fuel industrial growth elsewhere. And the result? Starvation on a colossal scale. We're talking about as many as 10 million people dead from hunger. And then came World War II, which took that whole concept of total war to its absolute horrific peak. For the first time ever in a major global conflict, and this is a really grim milestone, more civilians died than soldiers. Way more. And this was a direct result of things like the strategic bombing of entire cities, politically motivated executions, and, of course, the industrial-scale murder of the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't some spontaneous eruption of violence. No, it was a calculated, chilling escalation. It started with state-sanctioned discrimination, things like the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jewish people of their basic rights. And that dark path led directly to 1942 and the final solution, the official decision to commit systematic industrial-scale extermination. The numbers here, they're just almost impossible to fully comprehend. The Nazis murdered 6 million Jewish people. 6 million. And on top of that, they murdered another 5 million people. This includes Slavs, Roma people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, basically anyone they deemed undesirable by their twisted extremist ideology. So, as the world began to uncover the full, sickening extent of the Nazi death camps, the global community was just stunned. They came together completely united by this shared sense of horror and this deep, deep desire to make sure a catastrophe like this could never, ever happen again. And from that horror, two simple words emerged, a powerful, solemn vow: never again. This was meant to be so much more than just a slogan. It was supposed to be a moral commitment, a standard that the conscience of the entire world and the actions of every nation would be measured against from then on. And yet, that promise wasn't kept. The decades that followed World War II would become this painful, tragic testament to the international community's failure to step in, to intervene, as history began to repeat itself with a chilling, heartbreaking frequency. You know, the first big test of this promise came in Bosnia. See, Yugoslavia was this incredibly diverse, multi-ethnic country, but it was held together for decades pretty much by the will of its leader, Tito. But when the Cold War ended, the country just shattered, and all these long-suppressed nationalist hatreds just exploded into open war. Under a man named Slobodan Milosevic, Serbian nationalists went after their goal of an ethnically pure state, and they did it through a brutal campaign that they actually called ethnic cleansing. Their main targets? Bosnian and Kosovar Muslims. And for years, the world just mostly watched, stood by as over 300,000 people were killed. Then we go to Rwanda, and here the seeds of this genocide were actually planted way back in the colonial era. The Belgian rulers there played favorites, basically amplifying divisions by favoring the minority Tutsi population. So after independence, the majority Hutus took power, and decades of resentment just simmered until it all boiled over in 1994, when the Hutu president's plane was shot down. What happened next was one of the fastest, most brutally efficient genocides in all of history. Hutu extremists organized the slaughter of up to 1 million people. 1 million people, mostly Tutsis, but also any Hutus who were seen as moderate, and they did it in just 100 days. The world's response? Tragically slow, gravely inadequate. It was a complete and catastrophic failure of that never again promise. And believe it or not, the pattern just kept going, right into the 21st century. This time in the Darfur region of Sudan. A rebellion by non-Arab groups back in 2003 was met with an absolutely terrifying response from the Sudanese government. What did they do? The government armed and basically unleashed a brutal militia known as the Janjaweed, and these guys just swept through villages targeting non-Arab populations. They killed over 200,000 people and forced millions from their homes. It created a massive humanitarian disaster that just went on for years, even with all the international condemnation. Okay, so after walking through all of this tragic history, what's the takeaway? What's the fundamental lesson here? Is there something that connects these repeated catastrophes from the fields of Europe all the way to the hills of Rwanda? It turns out there is a common thread. The thing that connects the Holocaust to Bosnia, to Rwanda, to Darfur, it's this terrifying combination of extremist ideology and state power. Think about it. In every single case, you have a group that defines itself by hatred, and when that group gets control of the government, they turn all of its resources into weapons to try and eliminate a population that they've labeled the enemy. And all of this leaves us with a really stark and, I think, vital question for our own time. We've just seen how that promise of never again was broken time and time again. So looking at the world today, we have to ask ourselves, have we truly learned anything from all this? Or have we just gotten better at looking away?